Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to try to condense about 4 months worth of discussions and analysis into 20 minutes to a half an hour, and hopefully I'll come away having left you with a lot of food for thought, understanding not only how we approach this, how we work together with the commission, but ultimately how we came to the result that we did. So our understanding of what you all expected from us was to consider ways to right-size the district. People hear that term all the time. What that term means to us is that you're taking the spatial capabilities that you have and making them dovetail to fit uniquely with the loading conditions that you have. How many students are coming in? What grades are they in? What kinds of classes are they taking? Where are they coming from? How do we develop facilities to make and how do we arrange facilities to fit those needs coming in? Secondly, looking secondarily at the programming options that may result, and you'll see one option, actually one group of options tonight, that there was a supplemental consideration within that option where the commission looked at a programmatic change, a very subtle programmatic change, but nevertheless a programmatic change. Thirdly, looking at all aspects of the pre-K program that you have here, not just looking at one portion of it. I know early on in the study, some of the reporters picked up on the fact that we looked at the elementary enrollment and the elementary capacity, and we said you're operating at a level that is really quite good, that you aren't wasting space, you aren't overloading schools, and I think at that point there was a little bit of a shift where people started thinking, oh, well, let's not look at the elementary schools anymore, let's just look at the secondary. Want to assure you we kept that all in play, and the commission kept on looking at elementary to see if there was a way to make that better as well. Considering the grade level configuration changes. So right now you have a pre-K and you're through 5, and I guess just recently you're talking about having more pre in there, more pre-kindergarten in your mix. You have your 6 through 8 middle schools and your 9 through 12 high schools. What was communicated to us was you weren't absolutely married to that you were willing to consider options for reorganizing your grade level structure to see if that could lead to cost reductions. Next, looking at school consolidations, closures, that was right up front. Sometimes we get into these studies and people really want to shy away from the closures because they become difficult to deal with. The closures were on the table as a possible outcome, and also to consider the non-educational, directly educational buildings, the admin, the transportation facility, food service operations, adult ed. And I think here the charge was look and see what you can do with the educational facilities, the schools themselves, to see if there's some type of synergy that might create the opportunity to get out of lease space, as an example. Final product expectations. To develop a set of recommendations for the board consistent with what I just showed you on the previous slide, and reflecting key considerations presented to the commission from the initial surveys that were conducted, the considerable engagement that we all had in the commission meetings, and I guess most key among those considerations, the topic that seemed to keep floating to the top was looking for cost reductions. Based on the review and analysis of data, what was that data that we were analyzing? 4 or 5 main categories. The space availability, the programming, when I say programming, how the space is used. For instance, when we looked at the high schools, we looked at them on a departmental level, because it wasn't good enough just to look and see if we had enough overall space available in the school. We needed to make sure we had the right kind of space. If you have twice as many general purpose lecture classrooms as you need, that doesn't do you much good when you have half as many laboratory spaces that you need. So you do have to look at it at the program level. Another data set was the space utilization. As I indicated earlier, there was some initial aha moments that came with the first publishing of our elementary capacity study, where it's quite simple. It's a student-centered arrangement where you're loading a certain number of kids into each classroom, and that's consistent among the grades at the elementary levels. That's in strong contrast to what you see at a middle school or a high school. At the middle school or a high school, you're going to see that the capacity is really a function of how you're scheduling the school, because the students are no longer the schedule is no longer student-centered, it's subject-centered. So it's a matter of taking the scheduling load that's coming in for each student that has to take certain types of classes and meshing those all together so that you end up with a smooth running machine. Another data set that we looked at, and this was primarily my project colleagues from Davis Demographics, looking at the changes in enrollment. What was changing at each grade level? Where was it changing per the enrollment zones? Were there some enrollment zones that were growing, some that were shrinking, some staying the same? What was the overall net effect of that? And then how did that play against the backdrop of your facility capacity? And then I just want to reemphasize, as a matter of scheduling, not just the scheduling in and of itself, but the mode of the scheduling. One of the things that I think were revealed to the commission that they might not have thought about before was when you looked at the scheduling of the high schools, for instance, where it's a purely subject-centered schedule. You compare that with the middle school scheduling, where it's groups of students in teams. There was a huge difference in the efficiency of the schools based on whether they were middle schools or junior highs. Next bullet point, that this would be based on our analysis and our considerations. And I think one of the other contributions I think we made was that, and I can thank all of you for this, is that you had a commission that was there working with us, and they were really getting into the details with us. So we would collect all the data, analyze it, present it, review it with your commission. Your commission would take it in ask the questions, we'd give them a little bit more insight into how things were working. And I think that will form a little bit of a legacy for you, in that you'll be able to rely on not only the information that we've published. There's a lot of information that's published that's on your website, but also there's now a local understanding of how those options can work for you in the future. And then finally, after we got through the whole analysis and presented the information to the commission, they vetted that in public, and I think there was some very open discussion that took place. I want to review the process with you quickly. So the first blue block on the left, the formation of the commission, took place in September. You guys didn't really see us getting in front of the commission until late November, early December. While that period was occurring, the school district administration was in a huge data collection effort. So there was a good 2.5, 3 months of data collection, and I think it's always helpful to have somebody come in and do an audit of sorts to look at all the information that you have available for all the parameters I discussed on the previous slide. There were some instances where we uncovered flaws in the data that I think y'all thought things were working a certain way, and they weren't. So it was very helpful to just collect the data and validate it. The first step, to the second block from the left, the elementary capacity analysis. We looked at the capacity of each school and looked at the effect of having the district-wide special ed programs that would displace capacity in some schools. We then looked at the enrollment that was coming into each school and gave you the percent utilization that was happening at each elementary school, and then the overall aggregate percent utilization. 78%, I believe it was, which is really quite good. I normally, if I'm kind of starting from scratch and trying to help somebody rearrange their school system, will come up with a target of 85%. That's a very common metric that we use. So being at 78% with a number of smaller elementary schools, pre-K through 5, I thought was really quite good. The secondary capacity analysis, again, had to get in a little bit deeper. It wasn't just a matter of counting the number of students per classroom. It was counting the number of students per classroom each period in certain types of space, and that's what makes it tougher. Makes it tougher on the high school principals and the middle school principals to make their school run as smoothly as the elementary schools, because there's going to be a lot more change that takes place each period, and there's a whole new dimension with having to split the kids up and multiplex them back together into their own individual programs. The secondary capacity was much lower than what we normally see. And I do think that's a lot of it is that your schools were sized once for a much larger student body. And I know that I was contacted by some of the local media, and they were somewhat alarmed about the degree to which the secondary schools were loaded, that they were loaded so low. That doesn't really present itself to me as being something that's wasting money. You always have I call it the lock the door option, that if you have a whole wing of rooms in a school that aren't needed, you can always rearrange your kids to have them over in the bulk of the school that is needed, and then you can reallocate your staff into that needed section of the school. So just looking at the capacity metric in and of itself isn't wasteful. I think that if you're going to look to improving that, it comes as a function of creating an opportunity where you have a more streamlined schedule, and some of those alternatives did show up in the options that I'll review with you. As a parallel process, the fourth block from the left, the demographic study, our partners, Davis Demographics, they geocoded the location of every student in the school, or took the geocoding that you already had for your transportation and validated it, sorted through it, and then made projections to show what the enrollment would be in the following 7 years. They also went in and worked with the housing department to see what new housing developments were on the were in the development and in various stages of development, either being constructed, being planned, or being commissioned. And they developed various statistics to forecast how many students would come out of those individual housing plans. That gave you your future loading. So on all of the blocks to the left, we have the capacities, and at this point, at this juncture, we have the loading that's coming in that we hope that the capacity can support this enrollment that's coming. And the answer is that it did. Formulation of options. So after giving everybody the insight through these first 3 steps, and let's not forget that there was a survey that you conducted really at the very beginning of the process. When everybody got an understanding and saw how things were working, they were educated into the ways of facility planning. The commission broke up into 3 groups, and each group came up with a reconfiguration option. In one case, the one group said, we can't really come up with anything by ourselves, but we'd like the planner and the administration to help us come up with one. So that's how that option came about. And then I also threw another option in myself. The next step to the right was to analyze those options. So we went from a very conceptual level with just some overall option mission statements, and we broke them down. We did floor plans for each option and each version of each option. We came up with staffing plans that would go along with those options, and then we're able to take the staffing plans and turn that into a potential cost reduction, or in some cases, a cost increase to implement that option. So, as I discussed before, when we had something as simple as an elementary school, yeah, you're putting 20 or 22 kids in a classroom. That's pretty straightforward. When we get into the secondary schools, it called for us to go in and produce essentially a hypothetical schedule that the kids would follow, so that we knew how many rooms were needed and how many teachers were needed to carry out your plan. From there, information went back to the information we produced along with your administration, went back to the committee, the commission, and they went through it and came up with their recommendation. I'm just going to put this up here so you can compare and contrast there's really 5 options here, because there's a 1A and a 1B, but let me move into the next slide where I actually have the details of 1A. So this option is a K-12 expeditionary learning school. The remaining 10 through 12th graders would go to another high school location. They didn't decide whether it would be Deering or Portland or Casco Bay. There would be 3 6 through 9 middle schools. The adult education would move to Casco Bay. The central office would move to an open middle school along with Bayside. And this option potentially closed one middle school, an elementary school, and then the central office and the adult education relocate. And you can see in the block plan down to the left the grade levels of each building and how this change takes place. The staff utilization here is just a very minor increase. So we're seeing an increase in option A. A 5-person increase in staff yielded an increase of over $1 million. So this did not save money. Let's go to 1B. So same theme that was presented by the commission. However, this one we changed to 2 grade 6 through 9 junior high schools, and just that simple change flipped the switch from increased costs over to savings of $2 million. So sometimes you can study these by yourself and look at 1A and 1B. So the concept was basically the same in both, but that switch from the 6 through 9 middle schools, where we were able to schedule them as junior highs, we went to a subject-centered scheduling as opposed to a student-centered scheduling, and that resulted in a $2 million savings. Option 2, this one was to take to have one 10 through 12 high school. Casco Bay would remain as a 9 through 12. You would have one 7 through 9 middle school at the other high school site, approximately 1,400 students, 2 5 6 buildings, presumably at the middle schools, 500 students each, and then the elementary grades would drop down to pre-K through 4. This would potentially close one elementary school, removing 500 fifth graders, and this would require redistricting. This would also have the central office and the adult education relocating to the closed middle school. So let's look at how this one stacked up. This one was the biggest saver. So this had a staff reduction of almost, with the low estimate of, and we're using the low estimates on all of these, of almost 30 teachers for a savings of almost $2.8 million per year. And let me just say real quickly, when we look at the difference between the low estimate and the high estimate, within our study we had 4 variations of your staffing plans. The version A was the 25 students per section with each teacher getting their own classroom. Version B was 25 students per section with collegiate scheduling, where the teachers don't get their own classroom, they move around and share classrooms. C was an average of, or a maximum of 28 students per section, every teacher gets their own room, and then D was 28 students maximum per section with collegiate scheduling. So within that range, you could see how if you go from 25 per section, one teacher having their own classroom, up to sharing classrooms at 28, you could really jump up the savings. Option 3, this one is 1 10 through 12 high school. Casco Bay would remain 9 through 12. That seems to be a fairly common theme. 1 8 through 9 middle school. 2 6 through 7 buildings, 500 each. The elementary remains the same or is redistricted to even out the enrollment. Includes pre-K to the fullest extent possible, closes the adult education, the central office and adult education relocate to the middle school along with Bayside. You can see how that looks in the block diagram. This one has a cost savings of almost $800,000 per year. And then finally, this was one that I threw in for good measure, mainly because it's one that I have done numerous times in the past for other districts quite successfully, and it's to keep all your existing schools in play, but change the grade levels of them. And the best place to look at this is down at the block diagram on the right side. You see how the schools become put into groups of two, with Ocean Avenue and Presumpscot, Rowe and Longfellow, Lyseth and Riverton, East End and Reiki, and then the island schools, they stay the same. And the concept here is that you're taking you're taking one of the two in the group and you're making it into the primary school, and you're making the other into the intermediate elementary. In each case, I took the enrollment zones were right next to each other, and I tried to take the school that was the smallest and make it into the intermediate so that I could take advantage of having the higher section capacities at that school. So this keeps all the schools operating that you have, changes the way they're operating, and saves you $1 million per year. And at this point, I'm going to hand this over to the head of the commission, Mr. Peter Eglinton.
Thank you for having us here today. Thank you, John, for the overview of our work. I'm tired just listening to it again. There was a lot of material, and I want to thank the members of the commission for turning out, and paying attention, and really delving into some potentially difficult areas. It's a testament to the seriousness that we had such a mix of community members, teachers, administrators, and staff come together, identify some fairly challenging options, and put forward for public comment the one that was probably the most challenging to implement, but would save the most money. And was all of the options were developed based on models that are used elsewhere. We weren't making them up, but it became very clear that any of these options would be very difficult, and but we persevered in our discussions. And I'd like to, as my statement, I'd like to read the statement that we approved as a commission. It was developed by commission members Ben Grant, Councilor Kim Cook, and David Brenneman, but the commission as a whole voted for this statement unanimously. So I'd like to read that. It would only take me about a minute or two. The Enrollment and Facilities Study Commission was charged with evaluating the most effective and efficient use of our school buildings. The consultant provided relevant data indicating a steady K-12 student population over the past decade and in future projections, but also showed some facility inefficiencies. The Commission was asked to develop new ideas for potential reconfigurations that would use Portland's existing space more efficiently. The exercise of trying to conceive of new configurations at a single meeting and the resulting analysis and discussion raised questions that extended beyond the scope of the Commission's charge. Facility changes that impact educational programming need to be considered in light of education policy and district goals, as well as budgetary issues. For this reason, we do not recommend that the school board focus on any specific reconfigurations at this time. Rather, we recommend that the school board and city council consider the following issues in the larger context of Portland's budget and educational needs, and work to develop both a short-term and long-term plan that will ensure both efficient and high-quality education in Portland. It is imperative, number one, it is imperative that Portland's schools run as efficiently as practicable in order to ensure Portland offers a high-quality educational experience for students. Number two, the superintendent and school board have expressed a desire to expand and enhance educational programs and services in the future, which, if approved, require additional state and local tax dollars to implement. I guess you'll hear a little bit more about that later. While efficiency is suboptimal at some schools, the study commission did not uncover any obvious or easy reconfigurations that would improve efficiency without significant educational programming changes. Number four, in the near term, the school board and school administration should seriously evaluate filling excess space in school buildings with programs or offices that currently exist outside of the elementary, middle, and high school buildings, in particular school administrative offices and Portland adult education. Any future consideration to reconfigure educational programming should not be done hastily or by a group solely charged with looking at demographic and efficiency data. Major shifts in grade configuration involves educational, programming, and transportation considerations that went beyond the charge and scope of the study commission. I have to say that there were a few on the commission that were frustrated because we spent quite a bit of time going over the data, and we had the charge to find a way to save significant funds. And so to come forward and to say, we're not recommending any of the options we looked at, initially felt frustrating, at least to me, and I think a few of my colleagues. I would say, pointing to the next slide, that I believe there's quite a bit of value in the work of the commission, and I have no regrets for any of the time spent, both at meetings and preparing for them. And I appreciate the work of the district staff and the consultant to pull all the information together. That information is going to be very helpful for you going forward. I think every year you're going to face significant challenges with the budget. It's always happened. It's going to happen again into the future. And the knee-jerk reaction by many is, why don't you just redistrict? And we haven't had good data on that in the past. We've had hunches, but we haven't had good data, and we haven't had the chance to actually look at options. And so, if nothing else, the options that you see show the level of change that would be required to save something on the order of $2.8 million if all you were going to do is handle the buildings. I think being a former board member and chair and a former chief operations officer for Portland Public Schools, that list and the idea of what you have to look at to see how much money you're going to save is valuable. I would say that the information going forward will be helpful in other ways. We looked at the overall building use, but as Mr. Thomas brought up just now, we kept school size in terms of, class size and the use of the classrooms at the high school level constant. So in some regards, the savings that we identified could be even higher if you had more students per class and didn't allocate one room per teacher. So there's elements of this that could be used in the future, but the buildings themselves are a relatively small part. In fact, there were suggestions that we simply move a school, changing nothing else, into the existing space at Portland High School. For instance, moving Casco Bay High School there. Not significant savings around that. We don't own the school school district doesn't own the buildings, and so any buildings that are sold, the funds go to the city and not to the school. So you can't count on that. And we have debt service, which is on a yearly basis not significant, and our lease is over for Cathedral isn't of the magnitude of millions. I've been assured by the superintendent that that this, even though it says up here that the options explored do not have a shelf life, that the information that we developed won't be just put on the shelf, that it'll be a resource for your discussions going forward. And so with that, I'd just like to once again thank the members of the commission. Several of them are here. Commissioner Grant's here. Commissioner Crowley is here. And Commissioner Olafson's here. And then Commissioner Morioni, and Ms. Thompson is not here tonight, but she was on the commission as well. Hopefully I didn't miss anyone. I just want to thank you and the staff for helping to put all this together.
Thank you, Mr. Eglinton. Do we have any questions on the motion?
At some point.
Yeah, I do too. Is there any public comment on the motion? Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Inabansa had a question. I actually do have a question as well. Mr. Inabansa.
Do you know what would happen to like teachers? Like, you know, like what would happen to like teachers if we created like, you know, like option 2, option 3, like all the options, and like what would happen to the teachers if like classrooms had to be reduced and stuff? Would teachers have to be laid off or something like that?
Yes, that's correct.
So like, I just have a real quick question. I was able to attend most of, actually all the commission meetings except for one. And I remember in one of the initial sessions, one of the commission members, I believe it was Mr. Dana, he asked if it would be possible for the members of the commission to visit the buildings at any point during the process. I'm wondering if that opportunity was ever capitalized by anybody. I know that obviously we have representatives from our unions who actually work in these buildings, but I'm wondering about the community members.
Sure. We did not have an opportunity to visit the schools as a body, but we invited those individuals who were interested to contact the superintendent and arrange for it. So I don't know if anyone took them up on that.
Yeah. Excellent. One last question. I've lost my thought now. Oh, jeez. Oh yes, one last question. As the charge of the committee was to find savings, potential savings for the district, and I'm seeing a document that's attached to what ultimately was approved by the commission, there is a quote-unquote charge in this document for us to seriously evaluate filling excess space in the school buildings and with programs or offices that are currently not exist. But I heard a moment ago by Mr. Thomas that those empty spaces are not really efficiencies, and filling them up wouldn't necessarily create any savings. And so, well, I probably don't need Mr. Thomas to answer this question. I'm more interested in seeing what is the basis for that recommendation that doesn't, in my opinion, fit the charge of the commission and is not attached to a dollar figure.
So that particular recommendation was put forward as an amendment by several of the commission members, and so it was adopted along with the rest of the statement. Part of the charge was to look where relevant, look at the available spaces in the buildings for non-school purposes. And so broadly, it fit within the charge that we were given when we started on our first day. We didn't have much discussion about moving non-school activities, with the exception of how we identify them in these options, which envisioned moving them to a middle school or another space. My hunch is, because we didn't specifically look at the dollar amounts for that, but that the dollar amount, it wouldn't be a cost savings or a significant one, particularly because of the, where you're going to get your biggest savings is where you can reduce the staffing. So there wouldn't be significant impact from that. It would just be using the space more efficiently. And perhaps allow for another space to be released.
We did actually quantify both of those potential moves. So I don't remember the exact figures, but the mortgage payment, the debt service on the administration building is in the $200,000 range, and the lease at Cathedral for Portland Adult Education is in the $200,000 range. So between the two of them, we do not have, that was part of the analysis, we do not have a location that lends itself to taking in Portland Adult Ed. So the consideration of Portland High School was not adequate. It was, for 15 classrooms, they have 16 classrooms now, and so it is not something that you can just make it happen, and there's no loss involved. So I think that was ruled out on the basis of the fact that there just wasn't the right space. And there's lots of other considerations around parking and things along those lines, around having adults in a building where we also have teens. All of those things, we did not, for all of those reasons, we did not advance that as a viable opportunity. So.
Thank you, Superintendent. Ms. Bondo, you had a question?
Yes, I just have a question. When I see then the way we can try to fill some of those space, I think my question is about Mr. Davis. When you've been studying those classes, about the configuration of some of those classes, are you feeling like in the future, if you want to try to maximize those classes, about some of the labs, to try to create some other technical labs, like a science labs, because this is really important to try to move some of those achievement gap, having those labs in the high school for science, for STEM, so our students can be able to have hands-on on those different activities, instead to send them to go to the Institute of Research looking at those cells. As a biochemist myself, I've been learning on that kind of atmosphere, having the labs in the school, so you can be able to search those cells under microscope, just having your hands up. So are you think that maybe for the future those space can be used for that? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually, you said it quite well. I think when you look at the specialized kind of space, that there's a certain report that we did that broke everything into those categories, and you want to pay really close attention to how those specialized spaces are loaded. And I would note that in particularly in Portland, maybe not so much in Deering, but in Portland, they're not real flexible, because in a lot of the newer high schools, you see what they call it a combo lab, right, that it's a mixture of lab and lecture space, and it gives the instructor the opportunity to have all their kids scheduled for a period. They show up on the class schedule, and then they can use the abilities of that space however they want to use it. That isn't going to happen at Portland, because the rooms are too small. You have a chance of that happening at Deering. Right. But yes, it's something you have to keep a close eye on.
Thank you. Any other board questions? Ms. Bigdor?
Following up on the chair's question about this recommendation regarding filling excess space, I was curious that this was ultimately included, given that I don't believe that there was. Well, so my question is, how much conversation was there around this recommendation among commission members?
So there was general discussion in our small group discussions, and as the superintendent correctly raised, we did cost out specifically moving Portland Adult Ed into Portland, which is one of the elements of this. As you may experience as part of this body, there are amendments that are brought up and discussed. There's an opportunity to ask questions and debate, and then passage. And so that particular element, if it had come up even earlier, maybe we would have had more discussion about it. But it was in the moment.
Am I correct that it wasn't discussed in the moment at that final meeting?
Right.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Okay. Any other questions? Ms. Maroney?
First, I want to say thank you to my fellow board members for giving me the opportunity to be on the commission. And I, again, regret that we didn't bring back from the commission something for us to really sink our teeth in and potentially agree upon. I also want to thank Mr. Eglinton for his leadership. It's always a pleasure to be with him, and he navigated all of this extremely well, so thank you so much for that. And thank you to our experts that came to work with us. Not an easy bunch at times, but I appreciate it. Having time to reflect even after this, I think we felt a bit hamstrung in a way by not being able to get our heads around the programmatic piece of it all. And one of the commission members even said, these are not widgets we're talking about. We're not talking about, okay, we can just, count them all up. We're just going to pick them up and move them over here. The capacity of a building is not the similar, you can't think of it as putting, widgets in a box and looking at it that way. And she was right on when it felt very hard to think of it in broader terms when you couldn't really foresee how programmatically it would be beneficial to our students. So in my mind, going in, thinking about it, reason why I'm serving on the board is how can I be of best benefit to our students of the district, right? So with all of us thinking in that frame, it was hard to come up with something to say, okay, just look at it a cost-effective way without taking a look at, is it also in the best interest of our students and their learning? However, since our work on the commission, I've had time to ponder and think about things. And one question I have just for us to consider with staff to look into programmatically is we seem to be struggling with a couple of things right now. We seem to be struggling with the fact that we have paths it's so vital right now for our students who need or want that additional education and opportunity in the trades fields to access, particularly Deering students with the block schedule, to get to paths on time, to get to classes, from what I've heard from students, at least. And then we have Portland, it seems, working much better with Casco Bay students utilizing paths, and that's great. But I still feel like there's a disconnect sometimes between our traditional high schools and paths. So then I started thinking, well, what about if we have efficiency, if we have space in our high schools? It used to be when there was no paths, that shop was inside our high schools, and these students could choose to do a shop class, and they had that access. So I'm just wondering if we could just consider and ponder what would it mean to have possibly even some of these paths classes relocate and/or, granted, there's machinery, there's big stuff going on at paths, but maybe there's other classes that happen at paths that could relocate into Deering and Portland so that accessibility is, shared, is back there too. So just something to consider. We didn't bring it up in commission, we didn't talk about that, but just when we're just thinking about efficiencies, what are we going to do with this space? And we're not going to gain a lot of money. This is not cost effective necessarily. It's just trying to think programmatically, and we could all start to think about, all right, what might be useful for our students' learning. And I just, like I said, I've been thinking about that and wanted to share that idea.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to public comment. So if there's any public comment on the motion, please step up.
Good evening. I'm David Hopkinson of 9 Grafton Street. Obviously, I have something to say about everything. I'm just going to stick with kind of where I've been in the past, and that is that I think the commission did a nice job with what it was brought, and that more time would have been necessary even with the charge that it had. However, I'm going to adamantly stick with that the charge that they had was wrong because of the 4-school bond. And especially now that we have our student leaders in here. The community voted to fix 4 schools, K through 5. We said how much money to spend, and we said how to spend it. That bond has intent and it has morality attached to it if it does not have legal standing. That money needs to be spent specifically on those schools as it was allocated. Every result coming out of the commission changed something within those 4 schools. That's not what was voted on. They shouldn't be considered as part of the process, and we should move on. They do have a shelf life. They shouldn't be on the shelf. Money was told to be spent in a particular way. We need to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Anita.
Good evening. I'm Anita St. Ange. I'm the director of Portland Adult Ed. And I just wanted to say for the public and also for the board that when people are talking about moving PAE into little spaces here and there, that in our academic programs we serve over 2,000 students in a given year. We have 16 classes. Many of those classrooms have 30 students in 5 different schedules, starting at 8:30 in the morning and ending at 8:30 at night. And these are vital classes for our community. We are using some space at Portland High School, which has been great. We've had our Education Academy there. We've had an intensive language class, and we're currently using one of the labs for one of our science classes. And Portland High administration has been great. We've loved being there. They've loved having us. But the security for our 10, 12 students who are going there is significant, and it should be. You shouldn't be having adults in high school students who are, who are wandering and whatever. So, for 10 students going to a lab or 12 students going to a particular class, that's fine. For 2,000 students, it won't work. So I think that when we start thinking about Portland Adult Ed, we need to really understand the breadth of that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Any other public comment? Okay, we'll close that. Is there any board discussion on the motion? Ms. Trevor?
I just wanted to once again say thank you to the commission and to our contractors that worked on this. I know it was a very accelerated timeline and a lot of information, and we did come into it because of budgetary circumstance, and we did give the guidance to look for cost savings. So I understand the frustration kind of not being able to come to a recommendation for that, but for all the reasons that Mr. Eglinton stated, I think this is valuable work to the board because at this point we can say we have looked at it. Last year we couldn't say that during the budget cycle, so now we have data to inform our decision making. So thank you for all your work.
Ms. Davis.
I would like to echo the earlier comments and thank the Commission very much. I think we actually have gotten valuable information from this, and thinking about we're now in a better place to perhaps pull back and really think about the portfolio of educational offerings that we have in our district and to look at how we are building those, expanding those, making clear pathways for students who desire to learn in a particular way, whether that's expeditionary learning or international baccalaureate. And we've now got data that will enable us as a board to look at how we may look at some educational offerings and changes that might make sense, because we've got the demographic data and the sense of, and a better sense of what our buildings can and can't do as we go forward. So thank you very much to the time and effort of the community members and the staff who worked on this. It was a lot of work in a very short period of time, but it is not work that will sit on a shelf. It's work that we will use going forward to guide the district.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Seeing none, I'll just chime in real quick before we move on to a vote, that I also am greatly thankful for all the work of the commission members and staff. It was a really condensed timeline for amount of work that normally would take much longer. So I do appreciate the work that went into it. I believe that the information that we gained from this study is valuable, and it will be used in our deliberations in many aspects of the board's work. Having said that, I believe that that information lives and is accessible to us separate of this document that's before us to accept and recommend. I will not be voting in favor of passing this document to the Finance Committee because I am not comfortable with the language here that asks us to consider filling space, in my opinion, simply for the sake of filling space. I'm not comfortable with a community that feels like empty spaces in our high school means that there's empty rooms that are being wasted. I hear from teachers all the time about creative ways in which these spaces are used, about ELL students who have to have special spaces to not be in general classes because they need a little bit of extra attention. I hear from teachers who have to work with substitute teachers that come into their buildings, and having extra spaces becomes incredibly valuable. So again, I believe that the information the commission brought onto or was able to review is immensely valuable, and it is accessible to the board outside of this document, and that's why I don't feel comfortable sending this particular document to the Finance Committee. Having said that, all those in favor of accepting the Enrollment and Facility Study Commission final recommendation and draft final report, and recommend to the Finance Committee for inclusion as backup materials during the FY 2019 and 2020 budget deliberations, please indicate. All those opposed? 1, 2, 3. So the motion passes with a vote, I'm sorry, I lost my count, of six in favor and 2 opposed, and the majority of the students voting with the majority. Thank you.